Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native Podcast. This is your host, Saim Safdar, and you are listening to Cloud Native Podcast. Let me set the agenda for today's podcast. You all heard about Kubernetes Podcast from the Google. It's a weekly news and interview show with insight from the Kubernetes community. So I thought we had discussed some of the basic lessons learned and other things people could use to fast track what they need to be successful with Kubernetes. So let's be ready for a roller coaster ride of what the intent of Kubernetes podcast, who started it, who was the first host, what you needed to run a show like this, how to find a guest for a Kubernetes podcast, to start listening to Kubernetes podcast, how I and you can fast track an ever growing cloud native ecosystem. And last but not least, Kubernetes is complex, but podcast isn't. Let's be ready for our warm welcome to the new host of the Kubernetes podcast, Abdel and Kaslin Fields, what they are planning behind the scene to keep you motivated and excited for Kubernetes and cloud native. Let's get ready. Thank you, Abdel, for being in the show. And thank you, Kaslin, for being back on the show again.
Hello.
It's good to be back.
So you were on the show before?
Yeah, I was on the show before.
Ah, well, welcome back then.
Kaslin was on the show, I think, episode 27, I guess. And we talked about how to write a CFP because this is the CFP time.
KubeCon.
So, as let's start. So I go to the Abdul. Can you give us your quick intro, and then I go to Kaslin.
Oh, no matter how many times I do this, I always find it difficult to talk about who I am. All right, so Abdel is my nickname. As Saim was asking me earlier, how can I say your whole name? Just go with Abdel, it's easy. I'm a cloud developer advocate at Google. I've been at the company for almost 10 years now, based in Sweden. Originally from Morocco, moved to Belgium, and then moved to Sweden. I focus on Kubernetes and service mesh. Networking primarily is my main area of focus. I come from an infrastructure background. I worked in data centers before. And right now, I developer advocacy on GKE and everything containers, and I get to do the podcast with Kaslin. So that's who I am.
And now Kaslin.
And I'm Kaslin Fields. I'm a developer advocate at Google Cloud, just like Abdel. And I focus on GKE, Google Kubernetes Engine, as well as open source Kubernetes. I'm also a member of the open source community in Kubernetes. I was actually just nominated for co-chair of SIG Contribex, which is exciting. And I focus on, of course, Kubernetes topics, as well as kind of cloud native, DevOps, containers type topics in general.
I think absolutely. I think it's a better to ask a question like this. What are you doing when you're not in the Kubernetes?
Oh. That's a very broad question. In terms of technology, yes, or in terms of in general, or
yes, I know you have been so many different places. I think if you if you search Kaslin, the Kubernetes is near to you. Don't search the word Kubernetes. Search the word Kaslin on the internet. That's easier to understand Kubernetes.
I like that. I like that advice. I also do a lot of drawing. My website, Kaslin.rocks. I try to share Kubernetes and technical information about the cloud native ecosystem with fun illustrations. So I guess that's what I do.
Yes, absolutely. Here's the website for you. Kubernetes covered. Where you go to the Kaslin.rocks. I think there's a new one, two diagrams is coming up. So can you elaborate what is it?
The website?
Or no, there's I think you have another illustration. The cloud native lands something.
Yes. So for KubeCon EU in 2020, I did a talk about the cloud native landscape, and kind of the hope was to give folks enough information to be able to navigate it effectively, because the cloud native landscape can be very overwhelming. It's a huge number of projects and a huge number of technical areas. But the whole point of the cloud native landscape from the CNCF is to help you find projects that help you solve problems. So it's split up into these sections, these categories of technologies. And so once you understand those categories, you can more easily navigate the landscape and find tools that you need. So that's one thing. And also on my site, my most recent stuff is all intro to Kubernetes stuff. So if you're not very familiar with Kubernetes, you can check out my introductory cookie container analogy there.
Yes, absolutely. Here's the website for you, Kaslin.rocks. Search on the internet and you will find some of the wonderful resources as well. So let's start about Kubernetes Pod. I believe this is the most watched podcast. A lot of the places people like to listen and learn. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the show started by Adam Glick, founded the
And
Kubernetes Podcast with Craig,
yeah,
and he hosted it until January of 2021 while at Google. And now he leaves, and the Craig is also leave the Google team, and now he is the cloud native advocacy or head of open source at Armo. So
Exactly.
now there are two new hosts of this podcast. And now the same question for both. When you first listen, or we first heard about this news from, let's say, from your peers, now you have taken the charge of running and hosting Kubernetes podcast. What's your first experience, both of you?
Abdel, do you want to start since I've already been talking for a bit?
Sure. um, it happened very quickly. It was over a very busy period. So this was October last year when me and Kathleen took over. And I remember I was in Morocco attending the conference, DevOps Morocco. And Kathleen, I think you were preparing for KubeCon North America, right, in Detroit.
Yep.
I don't remember if you were there or you were preparing for it.
I was preparing for it.
Yeah, it was going to happen after DevOps Morocco, right? And the transition happened very quickly because the previous host left very quickly. And I don't remember, there was like a bunch of late meetings that we had to do to try to, well, late for me at least, to try to figure, because the host used to live in New Zealand at the time. So, time zone difference, you can imagine how complicated it would be.
Late as in late in the day.
Exactly. Like,
yeah.
It happened very quickly. So I think we were just doing it in automated mode. We're like, yeah, let's just take this over and keep running it and we'll figure it out later, essentially.
Yeah. From our perspective, it was very like, we're doing all of these other things and now, we're going to do this as well. I mean, for me, I had been really interested in the Kubernetes podcast for a while. I had been considering trying to find a way in to maybe be a co-host or something, but I hadn't tried to pursue it. So I was really excited when the opportunity came up. And also, to be fair, Craig kind of started things moving before we heard about it. But when we did hear about it, we were in the middle of all of these other things. So it felt, it was challenging to get started.
Yeah.
Yes, and this another question. I believe you have already done some episode as I've taken the charge of.
We just
What was
published
the
one
first
episode today.
Yes.
Yeah, we posted one today.
Oh, wow. And what is your first host for the podcast when you run a show, like when you started taking charge of this show?
So, like we said, this whole process for us started right before KubeCon, which I was preparing for at the time. And we were like, okay, so we have the podcast now. We need to make sure that it keeps running. What can we do in a relatively short time frame to make sure that the ball keeps rolling? And I said, I'm going to KubeCon. I could just talk to people there. So that's what I did. I went to KubeCon. I literally walked up to random people in hallways and I said, hey, I'm one of the new co-hosts of the Kubernetes podcast from Google, and I'm looking to interview people about their experience here at KubeCon. Would you be willing to answer about 5 questions about how the conference has been going for you? And I would show them the questions. And if they thought they could do it, they would say yes, and we'd record.
Wow, absolutely. So I think there's a first episode that you have hosted might be KubeCon 2022 recap.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
I think Kathleen had to Amazon Prime a set of wireless microphones because
I did.
She didn't have those. So yeah, we had to put that like, I think basically, I don't know who mentioned this as an idea, but we jumped on it very quickly. We're like, yeah, let's do that.
Yep.
Yes. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of podcaster on the internet. There is I think Kubernetes podcast is, I think, if somebody is actually want to hide the complexity of the Kubernetes, they want to ask people to join me and let me know how I can hide from the complexity of the Kubernetes. So actually, there is so many podcasts on the internet. This one that you are actually running now is the most popular one because of the there is so wonderful guest has been arrived for this show. There is so popular figure. I think there's a huge list of people. I don't think so who have contributed to Kubernetes is not appeared on this show. That is the quality of this show for how these people actually making this show running. So is it, let's say if you want to host some podcast, let's say tomorrow, you want to schedule some podcast. Usually what I do is I will prepare a script for myself, create some banners, create some social media posting, and then I will rehearsal like how to actually pronounce some of the words actually I wrote in the description. How the process look for you?
Yeah, we actually do have kind of a process now. Granted, that kind of rough start. Abdel's been doing a fantastic job of documenting a lot of it, so I'll let him talk about it.
So, so one thing that we have to acknowledge out of the box is because the show have been successful before we became the new hosts. For us, finding guests is not an issue, right? We literally sometimes get people emailing us saying, "Hey, we want to be in the show," and we ignore them, right? Because there are reasons we want to maintain a certain kind of editorial like line with the podcast, so we don't want to turn it into advertisement. We don't want to turn it into like a sponsored content. We had emails before people said we are willing to pay money if you can give us slots, and we don't do that neither, right? So getting access to people is not an issue. We can email anybody and or Twitter DM them or whatever, and they usually are very, very open to the idea of being with us. The process starts with we have a content backlog. We have a list of people we want to interview for specific episodes. On each episode, it's either me or Kaslin taking the lead of reaching out to the guests and say like, "Hey, would like to welcome you," blah blah. We record the interview portion with the guest. So that happens now bi-weekly. We do one interview bi-weekly, but we're also trying to anticipate. So I recorded an episode last week. This is going to be published maybe 3 or 4 weeks from now. So we try to be as proactive as possible with the interviews portion at least. And then once we have the interview recorded, we send it to be produced. We have people who produce the interviews for us. So it does all the audio editing. Then we work on the news, right? So the news portion, it's again me and Kaslin collaborating over Google Docs. We basically go scout around the internet and see what happened in the cloud native space in the last time we did an episode. And the news are as diverse as we want them to be. So they could cover new projects, graduated projects, acquisition, people mishandling some communication, which have happened a few weeks back with one of these cloud native companies, things like that, whatever happens. So we write that, then we sit down and we record the news portion. And then we send that to the producers to stitch it to the interview. So traditionally, the podcast had the same format for a while, which is start music, news, music, interview, music, finished, right? When we took it over with Kaslin, we experimented with a few things. So one of them is the KubeCon coverage, which we're going to do one for the EMEA version tomorrow, next week. So we're going to do the same thing, just go around and ask people questions. So instead of just having one interview with one person, you would have multiple interviews with multiple people, because I think that's also important for those who cannot make it to KubeCon to be able to get like a behind the scene feel of how the conference was and stuff like that. So that's pretty much what the process looks like. I don't know if I forgot something.
And we also added in a segment at the end of interviews a lot of the time where we kind of talk about them, which I don't think was part of it before. So there have been a few kind of changes to the way the format of the podcast goes, and we've kind of developed a process.
Pretty much.
Oh, Saim, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. So I'm just saying, like, it seems like a lot of work because I'm doing this thing. I can understand, say, in theory, it's not, it can circulate up to Google Docs, add news on top of it, but sometimes it's take hours. And because there are so many news in it, you have to filter this out, what news to be added in, because sometimes it's a very tricky. You think this is a news, but when you start reading it, this is a marketing content in there, and then you have
Yeah.
to remove it. And
Very
running it.
intimidating to have that power to say this is news.
Yes, absolutely. So then we actually refactor, because the Kubernetes podcast is a neutral, vendor neutral. It's just for the stories, the knowledge sharing. So the complexities keep on increasing. You have a responsibility now back of you. Like there's a no vendor page, So seemed like it's a not a very. It seemed like, oh, just creating a doc, but it's take a lot of time, because I know this. This take a lot. Even if you add music on between of the sections, you might need editing between them. If you have a team, that's good enough. But sometimes you have to do things on your own way. You have given to the graphic designer, then make something. At the end of the day, you actually add all this in yourself. So I think for a lot of people, it's a very base, because remember, this is not your full job. This is your, I think this is your third priority or the fourth priority. You have two, three other priorities in place. So giving a fourth priority of 4 hours, it's a huge time, but it's a lot of the content you manage it to pull up as well. So another question, like there are people who are running this show. How do you capture the news? Like what story you want to cover? Because in the cloud native landscape, it's always so much. And if you invite, let's say, one open source project maintainer and not other, sometimes you feel some very bad. Sometimes it's been challenging to address why you wouldn't invite him in. How you address, how you actually face those issues, and how you actually talk to those people.
I have lots of thoughts about this, but granted, first, I want to clarify it is the Kubernetes podcast from Google. So we do this as part of our jobs, but we do try to keep it very vendor neutral. We don't get a lot of mandates from Google about like, you have to do this or you have to do that. They want it to be a community oriented, community driven kind of podcast. So we do it as part of our jobs, take it with a grain of salt, but we do try to keep it very community oriented. And for news, uh, and also for the amount of workload, I want to say having Abdel as a co-host is so amazing. If it wasn't the two of us together, I don't think we could do it.
Yes,
But for
absolutely.
the communications, yeah,
Yeah, I
sorry.
think we work as a team.
Yeah.
Yes,
A lot
absolutely.
of my work in open source is also about communications. So this concern about making sure that you are keeping a neutral stance and not looking like you're promoting any one thing is very, very important to the type of open source work that I do. So that kind of comes into play here with the Kubernetes podcast as well. So part of that is wording, making sure that you're not saying this is the best or this thing sucks. You're trying to be give everything a fair shake, I guess is a good way to say it, with the way that you word things. And then as far as the news that we find, um, it's up to us to go and find those pieces of news. There's no specific source that we use. We use a whole bunch of them. So again, it's up to us to decide, is this marketing content? Is it not? We have to read through it to find out. And then based on our knowledge of our communities and the ecosystem, we decide if it is something that we think our audience would find interesting. So we kind of make sure that we have a reason in our head that we want to have that news in there. So if anyone were to ask, I haven't had anyone ask about like, why wasn't I in the news? But if anyone were to ask, we would have some reasoning for why we chose these things, and maybe why we didn't choose theirs.
I mean, we
Yeah.
haven't heard anybody so far complaining about the fact that we didn't cover them as part of our
Yeah.
news portion. We only have a limited amount of minutes, of course, so we are not going to spend like half an hour talking about news. I think Kaslin said something that's very important. We have full control in terms of our editorial line, so no one is mandating us what we want to talk about. And I think from, at least from my perspective, it's usually starts with a topic. So the guest comes next after we choose what topic we want to cover. So the main thing we want to do in an episode is we want to talk about X. X could be eBPF, could be whatever, scalability in Kubernetes, could be whatever. And then we go and find, okay, this is the guest, this is the where that guest works, which company they work for is really irrelevant to the conversation together, right? So it starts typically with like, okay, we want to cover this thing, this specific topic, and then we will work from there. to find the person, the company. Well, if there is a person, they usually work in a company, and then and the news portion is basically using all sorts of sources, including just Google. Just there is a thing called Google News. You can type keywords in it, and it will tell you what happened, right?
Yeah. As in searching for things, not as in the company.
Yeah. We use the public version. We don't use something else.
Absolutely. And I think, because I think right now there is a trend you have seen, and I have seen it from my space. We've never seen a role like developer advocacy and developer relations before 3 4 years. It's just been kind. I think I think, but the Google has developer advocates might be a very long time, but not the other companies investing in developer advocacy or developer relationship as well. But now, if you look at the Kubernetes ecosystem, a lot of the companies has open source projects, and then they have commercial offering. They do businesses as well on top of it, and then they have a different teams, open source team, commercial teams, and then there's a person called developer advocate. And I'm chatting with Abdul during the show, like, if you want to travel to the world, this role is about a perfect role for you, where you might create your YouTube channel by traveling to the different places. So, and those people do these kind of stuff that you are doing, like running a podcast, going to the different people's section channels and talk about their KubeCon experience, the community experience, and this and that. But that roles needs some kind of prerequisites. It's not just a person who is actually graduating from the university is start doing this kind of stuff. It's take a lot of time to be to be in the place where you can ask good question for the audience. But right now, I see the interest, the focus was how your experience being in the developer advocacy, and what you suggest to the people who are people in this space can be do better to be a good at their job.
Shall I start?
Go ahead, Kaslin. You've been doing developer advocacy longer than I've been. So
Yeah.
That's true, I guess. So I think the point of being a developer advocate is right there in the title. Your job is to be an advocate for users, for developers, for technical practitioners. So in our case, we are in the Kubernetes and cloud native space. That means being part of our communities in the CNCF and the Kubernetes community, and having this kind of, I don't know if give and take is quite the right term that I want to use, but you want to make sure that you're giving back to that community. You are a part of it. You are participating, doing things that the community needs. And then as a part of it, you start to hear what the community is dealing with, the problems that they're trying to solve. And since we get to hear those things, we can bring those back into Google. And when we hear that we're trying to solve this problem for our users and we want to build this thing and we think that'll solve it, we can then give feedback and say, hey, I'm part of that community. I know a lot of folks dealing with this issue. Here's something that they need that you might want to consider as you're building that. So we are literally advocating for these communities within the company. And then also externally, we advocate for the products that we then create. We can go out there and say, hey, we created this product and we think it's really good for the community because it solves these problems that we've heard. So there's kind of this back and forth of advocating for Google sometimes, but also advocating for the community within Google.
Yes, thank you. And same question with Abdul as well, but I can add one more on top of it, because if you want to be at the developer advocacy, if you like this role, if you like traveling, to be honest, and you want to be a developer advocate, what things required from you? Actually, how I can be a developer advocate? That's a good question. How can be I'm a developer advocate? Any thoughts, Abdul, on this point?
yeah, so there are few things to unpack there. I believe that developer advocacy is a multidisciplinary role in itself, that pretty much anybody with any sort of background would probably find something useful to do in this role. And let me explain what I mean here. I'm coming from an infrastructure data center, very low level world. So I obviously have expertise that others don't, but I cannot, for the sake of me, draw like Kaslin does. I don't know how to do that. So I believe that we complement each other in the sense that Kathleen or some of my colleagues have skills and things they know how to do better than I do, and the other way around, right? There are people who are good with marketing. I am not gonna be good at putting together a booth for KubeCon. I would rely on our marketing team to do that. So there is like, it doesn't matter what your background is. There are few skills that you can always employ toward developer advocacy in general, right? If we think about it purely from a technical point of view, obviously the more experience you have, the better it is, because the way I like to describe it is that in order for you to go stand in front of an audience or talk about something, you have to be confident and you know what you're talking about, right? So you have to have some sort of level of expertise. And I'm putting level of expertise between quotes because it doesn't mean anything. It's just like a generic term that we use to describe. Like, I don't believe that there is such thing as one person more technical than another. I just think that there is your ability of understanding things is the most important one, I guess. Specifically for this role, Kaslin already mentioned, I think there is a couple of components in developer advocacy. There is an educational component. So it's knowing how to educate people on stuff, right? Knowing how to put content in a way that is easy to understand. And here there is actually, and I think Kaslin would agree with me on this. There is like a very fine line when you are a developer advocate between education and then sharing your opinions, right? So there is like quite a lot of there's a full spectrum between these two things. And I've seen a lot of people that goes more toward the I'm sharing my opinions rather than I am actually teaching you something. And I have done that before, right? Like I have a talk called "You Probably Don't Need a Service Mesh," which is clearly like, sharing my opinions, but I try to educate people, even if the kind of the title is clickbaity, if you want. So the educational aspect is very important. The technical aspect, I guess, is very important, especially if you're going to talk about fairly complex stuff. I would say also the ability of influencing again between quotes, influencing communities, influencing people, influencing even internal teams. Like we do work a lot with our product managers internally. We go and tell them like, hey, this is broken, you have to fix it, through various forms, right? So that's also important to be able to say, okay, among these 10 things I heard, what is the 2-3 main stuff that I need to bring up and say, hey, please fix it. This is important. People care about this stuff, right? So yeah, it's a lot of skills, I would say. It's not just one thing.
And influence without authority is something that we say a lot in developer advocacy at Google, because we have to have this influence where we're coming back into these products and saying, hey, I've heard about this problem from our community members, and I think you need to do it this way. But there's no reason they need to listen to us. We are not in their reporting chain. They are not getting judged or performance reviews on if they incorporated feedback from developer relations. So our authority completely comes from our credibility as being subject matter experts in the space. So it's very important to be very deep in the subject that you want to be an advocate for.
Yes, absolutely. I think you phrase wonderfully well, influence without authority. I think this covers a lot of the spectrum what you look at it. But I think what I can show from my experience, when I started this show, like Clouded Podcast, I never been thought of about what actually I'm wearing a hat of the developer advocacy or the developer relation. But I'm literally spending 3 years in Kubernetes hardcore, developing and seeing how HPA works, how Prometheus, Grafana, all these pieces. But I literally stuck. I think now I have know enough about it. Now I have to challenge myself, go in front of the people, and do what I'm thinking about. What my way of thinking is actually how the rest of the community feel about it. Because locally, I'm living in a different geography. Our understanding of Kubernetes is somewhat completely different to the people I'm talking to right now. But we are talking the same language of orchestration and containers. But might be the thinking's different. I noticed this from over the years that you're talking about same technologies, but your personas and use cases are different. And that's how I actually got into these new, like I spend a lot of time managing application. Let's forget about it. Let's talk about how can I actually tell people what the Kubernetes is, because when the Kubernetes started, I see everywhere there is a person who is actually taking this responsibility of telling people what Kubernetes is, because otherwise this community can't be grown. And I think thanks to the Kubernetes community as well, like they invested heavily on the community side. A lot of the feature, you look at the Kubernetes in new releases or the previous releases, they all come from the community. So I think that is a newest evolution that we didn't see in the past. That the community giving you the feedback what we actually need, and that's make a project is more mature. So I think the developer advocacy make huge impact at Google in different places, definitely. But right now, the companies, for some of the companies, I have talked to them. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of dual thinking. Right? So a good developer advocate can be good, can be a painstaking because they ask you, like the Kaslin mentioned a wonderful word, influence without authority. You're telling your developer use Prometheus on that use case, but they are not accountable for you. They are accountable for their team leads, might be, or are the subject of the matters expert. So there is a huge blurry lines between what you actually role is and what you actually talk about it. So I won't take much of your time, but there's a KubeCon coming up, and this is the worth mentioning what is happening in the KubeCon. And I'll start with Kaslin first because he's been a very, very active during the KubeCon days. I keep on reading his tweets as well. So, what is happening at KubeCon? Plus, what excites you most?
Oh, wow. So much. There's so much that I love about KubeCons. KubeCons are my biggest events of the year. I try as hard as I can to make sure that I can go to them. And so what are we doing at KubeCon this year? So Google has an event that's going on Monday. Interesting thing about KubeCon EU this year, it's 4 days instead of the whole 5 days of the week. So there's nothing officially KubeCon related that's happening on Monday. Day 0 has been 2 days for the last several years because there have been so many co-located Day 0 events that folks want to have, but they've moved it down to just 1 day again, which I think is wonderful. So a lot of companies are having their own events on Monday since there's nothing official with the conference going on that day. So Google is having an event on Monday where we're going to be talking about GKE and container stuff. I think Abdel, you're speaking at that, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. And then Tuesday is going to be the Day 0 events. And one of those is the Contributor Summit. So I will be on site at the Contributor Summit, which is an opportunity for all of the Kubernetes contributors to get together and talk about what's going on in the project and just kind of collaborate. There's all sorts of events and activities that'll be going on there. Like I mentioned, part of my work in the open source community is contributor comms. I'm one of the leads of the contributor comms subproject, which means that we'll be doing a whole bunch of communication among the contributor community and externally, especially during KubeCon. So you'll see a lot of tweets on @KatesContributors. I help coordinate that work. Thankfully, we have a lot of contributors that do a lot of that work these days, and I'll be thanking them on Twitter as well. And so that'll be Day 0. I'll be at the Contributor Summit. And then there's also lightning talks that day, by the way. I love lightning talks at KubeCon. Then the main event starts on Wednesday. I'll be live tweeting the keynotes, as I usually do. And Google has a booth there this year, which I'm really excited about. I'll be giving a talk in the booth. And I'll be hanging out there. I also designed some new stickers that we're going to have at the booth, so I'm excited about that. And I have a talk on Wednesday about the special interest group for contributor experience. I mentioned I've been nominated as a co-chair for that, so I'll be talking about the SIG kind of at large. And then on Friday, I actually have a talk with Rich Burrows, who's the host of the Cube Cuddle podcast. It's a 101 track talk with the title Build Your Path in the Cloud Native Ecosystem. So we're going to be using a whole bunch of quotes from our respective podcasts to help folks understand this ecosystem and how they can build their own path within it and build their career within the cloud native ecosystem. So those are some things going on with me.
Wow, you covered a lot wonderfully well.
Yeah, I thought maybe I should go second because I could fill in gaps.
But how you actually remember these news? It's too difficult. There are so many news.
Yeah, there's so many things that'll be going on. We have an episode of the podcast that we're going to be working on. We have a few episodes of the podcast we'll be working on while we're there. So we're going to have to catch news and try to put it in different podcast episodes and all sorts of things.
And
it will
interview
be a
people. And
Thank goodness there are 2 of us because I could not do this on my own.
Yes, absolutely. And now Abdul has, I think, lightning is some talks before the KubeCon, after the KubeCon. So busiest person is Abdul, and he will let us
So
know.
yeah, so there is a conference happening on the weekend called Cloud Native Rejects. So Cloud Native Rejects is a conference that have been running for, I think, as long as KubeCon have been running,
Close,
or
at least.
close. Maybe it started
Yeah.
at the second edition or something. Basically,
Yeah.
it's a bunch of people that got together and said, if you submitted a talk to KubeCon and if that talk got rejected, come submit it to our conference.
Because there's so
Um,
many wonderful talks, by the way, that get
that gets
submitted to
rejected. Yeah,
KubeCon, but they just aren't able to take them. So
yeah.
another wonderful conference just from that.
Honestly, I don't know if they are able to get in all the rejected talks because it's only 2 days
Definitely
and two
not.
tracks. So
Absolutely
definitely
not.
not. So they have to be selective as well, right?
They're also
Uh,
selective. Yeah.
yeah. So I got talk accepted there. So I'm going to be talking about software supply chain security in general, what it is and what it means for people. So that's Sunday. Then Monday I have the talk at the GKE Day we're doing at the office, and then we'll be interviewing one of the guests on Monday. Then Tuesday, we have another internal thing, like an invitation-only event that we're doing with our customers, GKE customers, in the office. And then on Wednesday, the conference starts, so there will be some booth work to do. We do also have, and this is something we've been doing before I joined developer advocacy, because KubeCon is a very good occasion for our customers to be able to meet people who usually live in the US, so they would travel all the way to Europe. We coordinate meetings between, product managers, experts, and engineers and customers. So there will be on and off 30 minutes meetings with just various customers that want to talk to us, ask any sort of questions, or maybe complain about stuff not working. We don't know. We'll see. But then, yeah, most of the conference is usually just walk around, see some talks. Usually, I don't really watch a lot of talks in person because at the end of the day, everything ends up being recorded and put on YouTube. So I try to catch some keynotes because keynotes usually is when there is the big announcements, like the big stuff coming out. I think I'm probably Kaslin is the same, pretty much looking forward to the keynote this year because it's the CNCF ambassadors announcement is happening during the keynote on Wednesday, right? So we're gonna have our mugshots there, I guess.
Yeah.
And then
All of us.
all of us, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just walk around. The exhibition hall is huge. This KubeCon is going to be the biggest KubeCon in the history of the conference. It's 10,000 people. It's already sold out.
Of EU.
Of EU.
I think an
Oh,
NA
yeah?
has been bigger,
Okay,
but
then EU.
it's
Sorry,
definitely the biggest of EU.
it's definitely the biggest in EU because they're sold out, right? They don't have any
Yeah.
more tickets. And yeah, there will be a bunch of things going on. There is the ambassador breakfast on Wednesday, so I'm looking forward to that one as well. If I can wake up early to make it. So yeah, there is a lot of. It's a very busy. KubeCon is a very busy conference. Typically, when you go there, it's have been my experience that you spend the entire week working pretty much from 9 a.m. all the way until midnight, right? Because you start with the conference and then you end up having dinner somewhere and then you go back home at 11 and then you repeat that for 5 days.
Yeah.
Essentially.
7 a.m. to 2 a.m. is what I worked every day during Detroit.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
I think you're definitely in the replica set over there. Absolutely.
Yeah, helpful. And as Kaslin said, having a second person to be able to cover the podcast is definitely a good thing because then we can both do the interview people at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. I think you covered one topic we should cover, like 10,000 registration. So this is definitely the biggest KubeCon EU. But I remember, I think the biggest KubeCon was 2019, right before the COVID start. In
Yeah, I
2019,
think
Yes.
this is, I think, more than 10,000, 13,000 or 15,000 people are there. And that is in NA, not in Europe.
Yeah, I think
In
San Diego in 2019.
San Diego,
I'll see if
yeah,
I can look it
probably.
up.
I think if you want to see like the biggest in terms of attendees, I think was 2020 because it was virtual. So the 2020 edition was, I think 20 plus thousand people, but it was online. And by the way, I don't know if you remember this, Kaslin, but I just realized yesterday that we are going back. Like this Amsterdam edition was supposed to happen early 2020, and we
Right.
had to cancel, right?
Yeah,
I
it ended up
absolutely
being
forgot
virtual.
about that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
So
it's like this return to form. It's very exciting.
exactly. And Amsterdam is a beautiful city. I really like Amsterdam. So
Also,
Yes, I
I
think
found numbers for San Diego. I see one estimate of around 14,000. So
Yes.
All right, so
So right
that's the
before
biggest.
that's the biggest one. But I think sometimes that Europe might beat this number as well, or might be the new Chicago might beat
It's getting
this
there.
number as well.
We'll see.
It's a prediction as well. But I think the 10,000 is a huge number. But I think there are definitely a lot of duties in KubeCon. You like traveling, you like meeting people, but it's personally is a huge day job. Like as Kaslin mentioned, like 7 to 2 a.m. Might be sometime you have 3 to 4 hours of sleep. And remember, there's a huge community people you need to meet because we're talking to them virtually. It's getting interest, excitement in our minds. Like we want to meet this person in person sometime. And now 10,000 people in there. Apart from 10,000, might be 300 your friends. How many your friends meet on that one day or 5 days is a challenge because you have to do the booth activities as well. So it's definitely, I think the KubeCon is a wonderful place to be in, but there is a, I think if you keep on traveling, you might dislike this as well. Like it's a huge, and how much break you deserve after KubeCon? That's a good question to ask. It's a
I'm definitely taking some time after KubeCon. I'm taking basically the whole next week off, though I might actually work on Friday because I have to do the
yeah,
contributor comms meeting. But but
that's good.
usually a lot of folks I know take the whole week off after.
They deserve to be in because otherwise the mind gets is absolutely. I think we have to set a high availability, otherwise
Yeah, I think
of that.
it's even also more heavy for Kathleen because you're coming from the like she's coming from the US, right? Like time zone difference also doesn't help, jet lag. So I'm gonna be heading back to Morocco for a week. So I'll be working, but I'll be taking it very light, very easy.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
Honestly, I think the travel from the US to EU makes KubeCon EU lighter for me because I am jet lagged, so I have to sleep more than I would
oh,
in North America.
that's a very valid point.
I will miss
Oh,
things and it will be fine.
It's a very valid
abs-
point.
You're
wow,
here
wow.
for me, Abdel.
But
Yes.
there are some person who has some insomnia. For them, this is might be it's another another disease. But without I leaving you the show, tell me what is the next plan for the Kubernetes podcast? If people want to listen to the new show, and then another question, like you already mentioned this point, like if you want to be in the podcast, get to talk about your open source project, you find a way, email, DM, we find a figure out because there are so many people you have to interview. And there are so many people and there's so many news to be covered. Like after the KubeCon, you might have ton news already in the pipeline. And there's a request coming up. Can I have be on your show? Then there's a possibility, or please stay relaxed and we will find a place for you. But there's a two question like what is actually the current roadmap for the podcast? I know there are some more news coming up, more podcasts coming up after the KubeCon.
Enduring,
Yeah.
hopefully.
So I think I can go. We have a very special episode coming, episode 200. So this is going to be the next one because today we published 199. So the next one is episode 200. We have a very special guest, a recurring guest, shall I say? Uh,
You might be
hope
able to guess if you look at past.
if you're a listener, probably you know.
Yeah.
So we're going to be publishing it hopefully next week. We'll see how things go. Then we have also a lineup of few guests that are going to be covering some topics that are bubbling in the cloud native space. There are some technologies that are how to say that are being like creating a lot of buzz,
Yes.
Trending, buzz.
trending. I would say,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, and we do have actually a few. I think that's one of the. I would say I would not call it a challenge because the cloud native space is moving so fast that there is new things happening all the time. And certainly, since the podcast from the time it started, it was mostly covering technologies and people. We are trying to also diversify it in terms of like, well, we don't care about technology. Like I don't know, like the example of Louis is one of the examples that came to mind where we covered scalability on Kubernetes. So that's not like a new technology. That's just like a challenge, a thing that they are doing with Kubernetes, right? I think that finding new interesting ways where people are doing some new interesting things with existing technology, using it in interesting ways, is going to be something that I certainly would like to focus on more, right? Because I think it would probably be boring for people to just have another person to say, oh yeah, there is this new tool that just graduated, this is what it does. I think it would be most interesting to talk about what people are doing actually with the existing stuff. So I don't know, that's my opinion. I don't know what Kathleen has in mind.
Yeah. So to recap, we've got probably like 3 or 4 episodes coming up after KubeCon that we're already working on. Episode 200. Should we teaser the technologies that we're going to be talking about and the topics?
Well, probably
Do
not.
you
We're
wanna
going to talk
wait
about,
and find out?
there is a technology that starts with W. We're going to be talking about it, right?
Yeah. And so we'll be talking about some really cool topics, which I'm sure that you'll hear about at KubeCon as well. And for folks who want to be on the podcast, we mentioned we do get requests. Sometimes we don't get to them, or but if you do reach out to us, we will at least see it, and we will try to figure out where it could fit into our schedule. So it'll be a little bit after KubeCon before we get newly suggested topics into the schedule, but we will be working on it.
Yeah, just email us, either DM on Twitter at Kubernetes Pod, or you can send us an email at kubernetespodcast@google.com.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think you mentioned W. I can understand the technology, but I keep it secret.
I think it's not really a secret. Everybody knows about it now, and I'm quite
Exactly.
confident there will be a huge keynote announcement.
Yes, I think it's
about
creating
it.
a lot of. It's a huge noise in the word W at this. There's a supply chain. SBOM creating a noise. I think last year and a few years. It's getting still in the horizon, but there's a new tools and technologies pop up. Right now, I think there's a backstage platform engineering or W.
I don't know.
And
Perhaps we should have an episode on that.
We cannot deny neither confirm that we are working on something like that.
I believe there is an episode on backstage. I believe it's missing.
It's on our backlog.
Yeah, it is on the backlog.
Yeah. But we are starting with covering the topic of platform engineering first as a concept before we go into tooling, because backstage is a tool, right? We need to talk about what is platform engineering first. Like what
And
I mean, yeah.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
yes,
Exactly.
absolutely. Let me share a good news. The CNCF recently rolled out a platform white paper, and somehow I contributed to it.
That's
that is
news. That sounds like
announced-
news to me.
That sounds like news to me too.
And that is announced recently. I think I announced it to the CNCF ambassador channel as well. So that paper is actually tell the different audience. We have not just the developers, the Fin people, the enterprise people, the different communities. So that platform paper is actually attendance for anyone who can read it. But that's the first version. This is the V version 1. So we're looking for more feedback from the community for the next version before it's actually get readily available for the journal availability. So we spend a lot of the time CNCF on these white paper, and it's been recently got published. And it's the blog posts are already been available on the CNCF website. And if you look at the graphic, then you actually might appreciate me.
Sounds like we need to go look at that blog post, right?
Yep, put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we should probably do that.
Absolutely. So let me wind up the topic of podcast today. So let me recap and correct me if I'm wrong. The very first episode of Kubernetes Podcast premiered on 30th of April 2018 of Kubernetes community with, I think the topic was Kubernetes community with Paris Pittman. And that's the beginning of the most watched Kubernetes podcast on the internet. And afterward, Kelsey Hightower, Joe Beda, Emily Fox, Benjamin Alder, Ricardo Rocha, Rob Scott Johnston, Jesse Suen from Argo, and James Laverick for Kubernetes 1.24 release, and Mitch Connors on IstioCon, and Sheepa by Bruno Andrade, Ian Coldwater, Tim Hawkins, and many more renowned figures from the Kubernetes community have appeared on the show. I believe I talk all the famous, but there are so many more. And Kaslin, have you been in the podcast as a guest?
No. We talked with Craig about this. And we were already at the point where we were going to be taking over the podcast before we really discussed being guests. And he didn't want to have the hosts as really guests, but he did feature us on a podcast before Craig popped off.
Yes, and Abdul, do you have a chance to have a guest in the podcast?
No, neither. So the only episode on which we were guests, I guess, was the transition episode, like the episode when we announced we are the new hosts. So no, we've never been guests.
Craig had a rule about never having the same guest twice, except for very special circumstances. So
Very special people.
that was our one time.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually when I'm researching on the topics and the guest, I see a very huge list of guests. Usually, when you look at the 200 episode in the different podcasts, you have 40 to 50 guests. But I think in 200 episode, there are very rare cases where the guest is actually being visible in two time. So that's a credibility of the show as well. So absolutely. So thank you very much for being on the podcast. So if you are into the Kubernetes and going to the KubeCon, I think never leave a KubeCon without meeting Kaslin, because he's a wonderful community member, and he will tell you around the journey of Kubernetes contribution as well. And Abdul is also a person. Abdul is a more approachable person, and he's been different places throughout the world. I think if you're in the Morocco, France, Romania, then Abdul is traveling in the next few weeks, and you should want to meet him as well. So I've not been in there, but my project has a booth in the KubeCon that's called Parallels, and that's a CNCF sandbox project. And I'm hoping to have a good contribution from the community. But I will talk more about it, but definitely you go to the K7, and right next to K7 is a W, and you will see what we're talking about. So in front of our project, there's a W booth is also available on the KubeCon, but there's a project booth coming up. I think KubeCon, the new thing that's happening in the KubeCon this time, usually the CNCF gives you the virtual office hours for the open source project, but this time they made a huge transition. They give a booth for the open source project, accommodated by the CNCF, and all being visible in the one place. And there's a link for that as well. You can go to the KubeCon 2023, you go to the project pavilion, and all the project listed. And that's a wonderful place to get involved in the different open source project, because some of the graduated project is also have secured a booth as well. So this is another good place to be in there if you are in the open source and the community side as well. With that, I believe we will be backing again. I will see Kaslin and Abdul again in the show in future sometime. Might be in the KubeCon and other episode as well. But meanwhile, go to the Kubernetes podcast.com if you haven't able to hear today. And if you doesn't able to hear, that seems weird to me. You are living in ages.
You are
you
missing
have
out.
to know podcast as well. And then there's a follow the Twitter handle. There's a KubeCon Kubernetes bot, and there's some article on the internet like this: Kubernetes podcast in 2019, the best episode of 2019 of Kubernetes podcast. I think this is available for the 2020, 2021 as well on the Google website as well. There's a website where you see how to write a CFP, because once the KubeCon ended, there's a new CFP season started, and that's the place you can write. We have an episode on this YouTube channel as well with the Kaslin, where he shares wonderful thought with me. Every time I write a KubeCon talk or CFP, I will go through these two links before writing something up. KubeCon 2023, the biggest event of the summer, I can call it, or in the Europe, is happening in few days. So go check that out. And with that, I will say thank you very much for tuning into this channel and listening to us. And we will be back again sometime with the same guest or more guest, depending upon the topic. But thank you very much, Abdul and Kaslin. Wonderful talking to you. We will meet again. Stay healthy, stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.